Calico Jack, the gentleman of fortune, the silk scarves fluttered like battle flags from his coat as he danced with death across Caribbean waters. And when John Rackham smiled, even the devil himself paused to admire the audacity of a man who dressed for his own funeral with such exquisite style. In the sweltering heat of Nassau's harbor, where the air hung thick with the promise of gold and the stench of desperation, a different breed of pirate was about to emerge from the chaos of the Golden Age's dying embers. This was no mere cutthroat with a rusty blade and murderous intent. This was a man who understood that piracy, like all great arts, required not just courage and cunning, but an appreciation for the theatrical grandeur that separated legend from mere criminality. The year was 1718, and the Caribbean had become a stage upon which the final act of the great pirate drama was unfolding. The mighty Blackbeard had just met his doom in the bloody waters off North Carolina, his severed head swaying from Lieutenant Maynard's bowsprit, like some macabre figurehead, warning all who dared follow in his wake. The authorities were closing in, the old brotherhood was crumbling, and smart pirates were either seeking pardons or seeking graves. It was into this maelstrom of violence and opportunity that John Rackham chose to make his entrance. And he did so with a flair that would have impressed the most jaded theatrical impresario. But let us not get ahead of ourselves, for every legend requires its genesis. And Rackham's beginnings were as carefully orchestrated as everything else he would accomplish in his brief but spectacular career. Unlike the mysterious origins that shrouded figures like Blackbeard in deliberate obscurity, John Rackham's early life was refreshingly straightforward. The son of respectable English merchants who had invested heavily in the Caribbean trade that was making fortunes for those bold enough to risk everything on sugar, tobacco, and human cargo, the young Rackham grew up surrounded by maps and manifests, ledger books and letters of credit, all the paper instruments through which the British Empire was transforming scattered islands into profitable colonies. His childhood was spent listening to sea captains spin tales of narrow escapes from Spanish guardacostas, of fortunes made and lost on the turn of a trade wind, of exotic ports where a man's reputation could be purchased with gold or earned with blood. By all accounts, he was a bright child with an inquisitive mind and an early appreciation for the finer things in life. Where other boys his age were content with rough-hewn toys and simple pleasures, young John gravitated toward silk and silver, toward books of poetry and treatises on swordsmanship, toward anything that suggested there were more elegant ways to navigate the world than mere brute force and animal cunning. His education was typical of the merchant class. Mathematics and navigation, languages and literature, enough classical learning to hold his own in polite society, and enough practical knowledge to manage a trading enterprise. But there was something in the boy that chafed against the orderly predictability of commercial life, something that yearned for the excitement and uncertainty that lay beyond the horizon of respectability. The transformation from merchant son to pirate captain did not happen overnight, and it certainly did not happen through any sudden revelation or dramatic catalyst. Instead, it was a gradual process of choices, each one seemingly reasonable at the time, each one leading inexorably toward a destiny that would have horrified his respectable parents had they lived to see it. His first taste of maritime adventure came through entirely legitimate channels. Like many young gentlemen of his class and generation, Rackham found employment aboard merchant vessels, learning the practical skills of seamanship while gaining first-hand knowledge of the Caribbean trade routes that connected the scattered islands of the West Indies to the great commercial centers of Europe and North America. He proved himself an able sailor and a natural leader, quickly rising through the ranks from ordinary seaman to officer. His colleagues noted his easy way with the crew, his ability to maintain discipline without resorting to the brutal methods that characterized so many merchant captains of the era. He had a gift for reading men's motivations and adjusting his approach accordingly, a skill that would serve him well in his later career. But it was during these respectable years that Rackham first encountered the pirates who would ultimately seduce him away from legitimate employment. The Caribbean of the early 18th century was a complex ecosystem. where the boundaries between legal and illegal commerce were often blurred beyond recognition. Privators carried royal commissions that authorized them to attack enemy shipping. But the line between privateering and outright piracy was frequently crossed when opportunity presented itself and official oversight was lacking. Rackham found himself fascinated by these maritime outlaws, drawn not so much by their criminal activities as by the absolute freedom they represented. Here were men who answered to no authority save their own conscience, who divided their spoils according to articles they themselves had written, who sailed where they pleased and took what they wanted from a world that offered so little to those born without titles or substantial fortunes. The seed of his eventual transformation was planted during these encounters, though it would be years before it fully germinated. For now, he remained content to observe from the margins, to listen to their tales and study their methods, while maintaining his position as a respectable member of the merchant marine. The turning point came with the War of the Spanish Succession and its aftermath. That great disruption that scattered thousands of experienced sailors across the Caribbean like seeds on fertile ground. Rackham, like so many of his contemporaries, found himself transformed from legitimate mariner to unemployed veteran with skills, suited primarily for violence and little appetite for the mundane alternatives that peacetime offered. The royal pardons that followed the war's end presented both opportunity and danger for men like Rackham. Those who accepted them could theoretically return to legitimate employment, but the skills they had developed during their years of sanctioned piracy were not easily transferable to peacetime pursuits. Many found themselves trapped between a past they could not return to and a future they could not embrace. Rackham's decision to fully embrace piracy came not through desperation but through calculation. Unlike many of his contemporaries who drifted into crime through circumstances beyond their control, he made a conscious choice to abandon respectability in favor of the freedom and excitement that piracy promised. It was a decision that would define the rest of his life and ultimately lead to his place in the pantheon of Caribbean legends. His entry into the fraternity of pirates came through Charles Vane, one of the most notorious captains of the post-war period. Vane was everything that Rackham was not: brutal, unpredictable, more interested in violence for its own sake than in the strategic application of force to achieve specific goals. Yet, despite their fundamental differences in temperament and method, the two men formed an effective partnership that would establish both their reputations in the pirate community. Under Vane's command, Rackham learned the practical aspects of piracy that no amount of legitimate maritime experience could have taught him. He discovered how to identify the most profitable targets, how to approach and board enemy vessels with minimal risk to his own crew, how to divide spoils in a manner that maintained morale while ensuring his own position as leader. But more importantly, he began to develop his own distinctive style and philosophy of piracy. Where Vane relied on intimidation and brutality, Rackham preferred psychological warfare and theatrical display. Where his captains seemed content to terrorize his victims into submission, Rackham understood that reputation could be more valuable than any treasure chest. That fear properly managed could accomplish more than violence alone. The partnership between Vane and Rackham came to an abrupt end in 1718 when their fundamental differences in approach finally proved irreconcilable. The specific incident that triggered their split involved Vane's refusal to attack a French man-of-war that Rackham believed they could have taken with minimal losses. The crew, impressed by Rackham's analysis and frustrated by Vane's increasingly erratic behavior, voted to remove their captain and elevate Rackham to command. It was a pivotal moment that revealed as much about Rackham's political skills as his maritime abilities. The fact that he could convince a crew of hardened pirates to abandon their established leader in favor of an untested alternative spoke to his charismatic abilities and his understanding of group dynamics. From that moment forward, he would be known not merely as John Rackham, but as Calico Jack, a nickname that captured both his sartorial preferences and his emerging reputation as a different kind of pirate captain. The origin of the Calico Jack sobriquet has been the subject of considerable speculation among historians and popular writers alike. The most commonly accepted explanation relates to his fondness for calico clothing. Those brightly colored cotton fabrics that were becoming increasingly popular in the Caribbean trade. But the nickname may have had deeper significance than mere fashion preference. Calico was a fabric associated with the emerging global economy that connected the cotton fields of India with the textile mills of England and the fashion-conscious consumers of colonial America. By adopting it as his signature material, Rackham was making a statement about his place in this interconnected world of commerce and culture. He was not merely a criminal preying on honest merchants. He was a participant in the same global system, albeit one who had chosen to operate outside its legal boundaries. His famous coat, described in contemporary accounts as a magnificent creation of scarlet calico decorated with silk ribbons and silver buttons, was more than mere vanity. It was a carefully calculated piece of psychological warfare. When potential victims saw that distinctive coat across a ship's deck, they knew immediately that they were facing Calico Jack Rackham, with all the implications that recognition carried. The coat became his signature, in the same way that Blackbeard's flaming beard had become his calling card. But where Blackbeard had chosen to cultivate an image of demonic terror, Rackham preferred to present himself as a gentleman of fortune, a man who had chosen piracy not from desperation, but from a sophisticated appreciation for the lifestyle it offered. His enemies might fear him, but they could not help respecting his style. This attention to appearance and presentation was characteristic of everything Rackham did during his brief but memorable career as a pirate captain. He understood intuitively what modern marketing experts would later codify: that image and substance were equally important in building a successful brand, and that the right combination of visual impact and operational competence could create a reputation far exceeding the sum of its individual components. His ship, like his clothing, reflected this sophisticated understanding of the relationship between appearance and effectiveness. The Revengeful he had renamed Vane's vessel upon assuming command was maintained in pristine condition. Her brass polished to mirror brightness, her sails kept white as Caribbean sand, her deck scrubbed until it gleamed like polished bone. She looked more like a gentleman's yacht than a pirate ship, which was exactly the impression Rackham intended to create. The psychological effect on potential victims was exactly what he had calculated. Merchant captains who might have fought desperately against a conventional pirate crew often found themselves strangely reluctant to resist a man who treated piracy as if it were merely another form of legitimate commerce conducted under unusual circumstances. There was something almost civilized about being robbed by Calico Jack, as if the encounter were a business transaction between equals rather than a criminal assault. This genteel approach to piracy extended to his treatment of prisoners and his management of captured vessels, where many pirate captains relied on torture and intimidation to extract information from their captives. Rackham preferred conversation and persuasion. He would invite captured merchants to dine with him in his cabin, serving them wine from crystal glasses while discussing the political and economic conditions that had led to their unfortunate encounter. These dinner conversations served multiple purposes beyond mere hospitality. They provided Rackham with valuable intelligence about shipping schedules and cargo manifests, information that could be used to plan future operations. They also helped establish his reputation as a gentleman pirate, a man who could be trusted to honor agreements and treat his prisoners with appropriate dignity. Word of such encounters spread quickly through the Caribbean's commercial networks, creating a psychological advantage that proved more valuable than any amount of firepower. But perhaps, most importantly, these civilized encounters with his victims allowed Rackham to maintain his own sense of himself as something more than a common criminal. He could tell himself and others that he was merely a businessman operating in an alternative economic system, that his methods were no more morally questionable than those employed by the slave traders and colonial officials who formed the backbone of legitimate Caribbean commerce. This self-image as a gentleman of fortune rather than a mere pirate was crucial to Rackham's psychological well-being and operational effectiveness. It allowed him to attract a higher caliber of crew member than most pirate captains could manage, men who were drawn not just by the promise of easy money, but by the opportunity to serve under a leader who treated piracy as a profession worthy of respect rather than a last resort for desperate criminals. His crew reflected this elevated approach to their shared profession. While they were certainly capable of violence when circumstances required it, they were also expected to maintain standards of dress and behavior that would have been the envy of many legitimate merchant crews. Rackham insisted on discipline and professionalism in all aspects of their operations, from the maintenance of weapons and equipment to the treatment of prisoners and the division of spoils. The articles that governed life aboard the Revenge were more sophisticated than the crude agreements that bound together most pirate crews. Rackham had studied the successful precedents established by earlier pirate captains and incorporated the best elements into his own system of governance. The result was a document that balanced individual freedom with collective responsibility, ensuring that every crew member had a voice in major decisions, while maintaining the clear chain of command necessary for effective military operations. Under these articles, the crew of the Revenge became something approaching a floating republic, a society of equals bound together by shared danger and mutual profit. It was an attractive alternative to the rigid hierarchies and arbitrary punishments that characterized service aboard legitimate merchant or naval vessels, and it helped explain why Rackham was able to maintain crew loyalty even during periods when prizes were scarce and danger was abundant. The success of his unconventional approach became evident in the string of victories that marked the early months of his independent command. The Revenge took prize after prize with minimal violence and maximum efficiency, building a reputation for both competence and civility that drew the attention of pirate hunters and admirers alike. Rackham had succeeded in creating exactly the image he intended. A pirate captain who was dangerous enough to be feared but civilized enough to be respected. But it was during this period of growing success that Rackham made the decision that would ultimately define his legacy and seal his doom. In the summer of 1719, while careening his ship at a secluded anchorage in the Bahamas, he encountered Bonny, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her fierce independence and her complete disregard for the social conventions that governed the behavior of respectable females in colonial society. Bonny was the daughter of a successful Charleston lawyer who had scandalized respectable society by openly living with his Irish servant girl and eventually marrying her after his wife's death. Anne had inherited her father's willfulness and her mother's passionate nature, along with a complete contempt for the restrictions that colonial society placed on women of her class and generation. Her marriage to James Bonny, a small-time pirate and informer, had been an act of rebellion against her father's attempts to control her romantic choices. But the union had quickly soured when Anne discovered that her husband was more interested in her father's money than in her person, and that he was perfectly willing to betray his former associates to the authorities in exchange for official favor and financial reward. By the time she encountered Rackham, Anne was thoroughly disillusioned with both marriage and respectable society. She was ready for adventure, ready for danger, and ready for a man who could match her own passionate intensity. Rackham, with his elegant manners and sophisticated approach to piracy, represented everything that her weak-willed husband was not. The attraction between them was immediate and mutual, a recognition of kindred spirits who shared a similar contempt for conventional morality and a similar appetite for the excitement that lay beyond the boundaries of respectable behavior. Within days of their first meeting, Anne had abandoned her husband and joined Rackham's crew, disguising herself as a male crew member to avoid the complications that a woman's presence might create aboard a pirate vessel. The decision to accept and aboard the Revenge was one of the most controversial of Rackham's career, violating both maritime tradition and the practical wisdom accumulated through generations of seagoing experience. Women aboard ship were considered unlucky at best and disastrous at worst, and most pirate crews would have refused to sail with a female member, regardless of her qualifications or the captain's personal preferences. But Rackham was confident enough in his leadership, and Anne was skilled enough in her disguise, that the arrangement worked better than anyone had a right to expect. Anne proved herself a capable sailor and a fierce fighter, earning the respect of her male crewmates through competence rather than sentiment. Her presence aboard the Revenge became an open secret that somehow remained officially unacknowledged. A collective fiction that allowed everyone involved to maintain their dignity, while ignoring the obvious reality. The romantic relationship between captain and crew member added another layer of complexity to life aboard the Revenge, but it also seemed to energize Rackham's already impressive leadership abilities. Contemporary accounts suggest that his operational tempo increased dramatically after Anne joined his crew, as if her presence had awakened some previously dormant aspect of his personality. Their partnership proved remarkably effective in practical terms. Anne's intelligence and intuition complemented Rackham's strategic thinking and tactical skills, creating a command team that was more than the sum of its individual parts. She served as his unofficial lieutenant and closest advisor, the one person aboard the Revenge who could challenge his decisions without undermining his authority. But their relationship also introduced an element of personal drama that would ultimately prove fatal to both of them. Love, even love between pirates, creates vulnerabilities that can be exploited by enemies and complications that can interfere with sound judgment. The very intensity that made their partnership so effective also made it potentially self-destructive. The first sign of these complications emerged when Anne encountered Mary Read, another woman who had chosen to disguise herself as a man in order to pursue a maritime career. Mary's background was even more unconventional than Anne's, the illegitimate daughter of an English sea captain. She had spent her entire adult life passing as a man, first as a soldier in the British Army and later as a sailor aboard merchant vessels. Mary had joined Rackham's crew during one of their raids, when the merchant vessel on which she was serving was captured and her crew given the traditional choice between joining the pirates or being set adrift in a small boat. She had chosen to join, partly from practical necessity and partly from a recognition that piracy offered opportunities for advancement that were unavailable to women in legitimate employment. The relationship that developed between Anne and Mary was complex and has been the subject of considerable speculation among historians and popular writers. Contemporary accounts suggest that Anne was initially attracted to Mary while still believing her to be a man, and that the revelation of Mary's true gender created a complicated emotional triangle involving Anne, Mary, and Rackham himself. Whatever the exact nature of their relationships, the presence of two women aboard the Revenge created a dynamic that was unprecedented in the annals of Caribbean piracy. Both Anne and Mary proved themselves capable fighters and reliable crew members, earning the respect of their male colleagues through demonstrated competence rather than romantic or sexual appeal. But their presence also made the Revenge unique among pirate vessels, a ship that had somehow transcended the traditional masculine culture of Caribbean piracy to create something entirely new. Contemporary observers struggled to categorize what they were witnessing, alternately fascinated and horrified by the spectacle of women who had chosen to embrace the violent, lawless life of professional pirates. Rackham himself seemed to thrive in this unconventional environment, as if the presence of Anne and Mary had liberated him from the constraints of traditional masculine behavior. His tactics became more daring, his style more flamboyant, his reputation more legendary. The captain, who had already distinguished himself through his sophisticated approach to piracy, now became something approaching a mythological figure. The Revenge's operational success during this period was remarkable by any standard. Prize after prize fell to Rackham's increasingly confident crew, each capture adding to their treasury and their reputation. The combination of tactical competence and theatrical flair that had always characterized Rackham's approach reached new heights of effectiveness, creating a legend that spread far beyond the Caribbean itself. But success bred complacency, and complacency bred the kind of mistakes that could prove fatal in the dangerous world of Caribbean piracy. Rackham began to take risks that a more cautious commander would have avoided, driven partly by confidence in his abilities and partly by a desire to impress the remarkable women who had chosen to share his dangerous life. The beginning of the end came in the autumn of 1720. When Captain Jonathan Barnett of the British Navy received intelligence about Rackham's location and operational patterns, Barnett was exactly the kind of opponent that Rackham's previous success had been designed to avoid. A competent professional naval officer with adequate resources and official backing, unburdened by the corruption and incompetence that had allowed so many pirate crews to operate with impunity. The intelligence that reached Barnett was accurate and detailed, suggesting either remarkable luck on the part of the authorities or betrayal by someone with intimate knowledge of Rackham's operations. The net was closing around the Revenge and her celebrated crew, though they remained blissfully unaware of their approaching doom. Rackham's final cruise began in October 1720, when the Revenge departed from their usual anchorage in the Bahamas for what was intended to be a routine raid against merchant shipping in Jamaican waters. The crew was in high spirits, confident in their abilities and anticipating another successful expedition that would add to their already substantial accumulated wealth. But the Caribbean had changed during the months of their greatest success. The authorities had become more systematic in their anti-piracy efforts. Naval patrols had increased in frequency and competence, and the network of informants and bounty hunters had grown more effective at tracking and predicting pirate movements. The golden age of Caribbean piracy was ending, though few of its practitioners understood the full implications of the transformation. The Revenge's final victims were a small group of fishing vessels operating off the coast of Jamaica, hardly the kind of rich prizes that had made Rackham's reputation. The raids were successful in immediate terms, netting a modest amount of coin and supplies. But they also provided Barnett with the precise intelligence he needed to locate and intercept the pirate vessel. What followed was less a battle than a foregone conclusion. The Revenge, surprised at anchor and with most of her crew incapacitated by drink, was in no condition to resist a determined attack by professional military personnel. Barnett's approach was swift and decisive, giving Rackham no time to organize an effective defense or attempt an escape. The actual fighting, such as it was, lasted only minutes. Most of Rackham's male crew members were too drunk to offer effective resistance, leaving Anne and Mary to mount the only serious defense of the vessel. Contemporary accounts suggest that the two women fought with desperate courage while their male companions cowered below decks, a reversal of traditional gender roles that scandalized observers and added another layer of complexity to an already extraordinary story. When the smoke cleared and the brief violence ended, Calico Jack Rackham found himself a prisoner of the British Crown. His career as a pirate captain definitively concluded. The man who had spent years cultivating an image of sophisticated competence had been captured in circumstances that were neither sophisticated nor competent, betraying the very standards that had made his reputation. The trial that followed was a foregone conclusion, conducted according to the forms of British justice, but with an outcome that was never seriously in doubt. Rackham and his crew were charged with piracy on the high seas, a capital offense that carried a mandatory death sentence for all convicted defendants. The evidence against them was overwhelming, the witnesses credible, and the political pressure for harsh punishment irresistible. But the trial also provided Rackham with one final opportunity to demonstrate the theatrical flair that had characterized his entire career. He conducted himself with dignity and style throughout the proceedings, never denying his guilt, but refusing to show the fear or remorse that the court expected from condemned criminals. He remained Calico Jack to the end, a gentleman of fortune who had chosen his path and was prepared to accept its consequences. The most dramatic moments of the trial involved Anne and Mary, whose gender was revealed during the proceedings and created a sensation that reverberated far beyond the Caribbean. Women pirates were unprecedented in British legal experience, and the court struggled to determine how to handle defendants who violated every assumption about female behavior and capabilities. Both women were found guilty and sentenced to death, along with their male colleagues, but they successfully pleaded pregnancy to delay their executions. Under British law, pregnant women could not be executed until after they had given birth, a provision intended to protect innocent unborn children that now served to spare the lives of two of the most notorious pirates of their generation. The delay proved crucial for both women, though for different reasons. Mary Read died in prison of fever before her child could be born, escaping the hangman through natural causes rather than legal technicalities. Anne Bonny's fate remains one of the great mysteries of pirate history. She disappeared from the historical record after her trial, leading to decades of speculation about whether she was eventually executed, pardoned, or escaped to live under an assumed identity. For Rackham himself, no such mystery or reprieve was available. He was scheduled for execution, along with the other male members of his crew, a fate that he faced with the same elegant composure that had characterized his approach to piracy. He spent his final weeks in custody, writing letters and making arrangements for the disposition of his personal effects, conducting himself more like a gentleman settling his affairs than a condemned criminal awaiting execution. His execution took place on November 18, 1720, at Gallows Point in Port Royal, Jamaica, the same location where so many other pirates had met their end. Contemporary accounts describe him as maintaining his dignity to the final moment, dressed in his finest clothes, and addressing the crowd with the same sophisticated manner that had made him famous throughout the Caribbean. The speech he delivered from the scaffold has been preserved in various forms, though its exact wording remains a matter of historical debate. What seems clear is that he expressed no remorse for his chosen career, acknowledged the justice of his punishment under existing law, but maintained that he had lived according to his own moral code and died without shame or regret. His body was hanged in chains at Rackham's Cay, a small island near Port Royal, where it served as a warning to other potential pirates and a grim reminder of the fate that awaited those who chose to operate outside the boundaries of legal authority. The man, who had spent his career cultivating an image of elegant rebellion, became in death a symbol of the price that such rebellion ultimately demanded. But death could not diminish the legend that Rackham had so carefully constructed during his brief but spectacular career. Within months of his execution, stories about Calico Jack were being told in taverns and coffeehouses throughout the Atlantic world, each telling adding new details and embellishments to an already extraordinary narrative. The presence of Anne and Mary in his crew added a romantic dimension to his story that distinguished it from the tales of other pirate captains. The idea of a pirate captain whose crew included two women who had chosen to abandon conventional femininity for the dangerous freedom of piracy captured imaginations in ways that stories of purely masculine adventure could not match. Writers and ballad makers seized upon the story with enthusiasm, creating works that romanticized piracy while safely condemning it, that celebrated freedom while acknowledging its costs. Rackham became the prototype for the gentleman pirate, the man who brought style and sophistication to a profession traditionally associated with brutality and ignorance. The flag that he designed, a skull and crossbones with crossed cutlasses, beneath, became one of the most recognizable symbols in pirate iconography, more famous in some ways than the man who created it. The Jolly Roger that flew above the Revenge continues to appear in popular culture, centuries after the ship and her crew met their doom. A visual shorthand for piracy that transcends historical specifics. His influence on subsequent pirate fiction cannot be overstated. From the romantic heroes of 19th-century adventure novels to the swashbuckling protagonists of 20th-century films, Calico Jack's elegant approach to piracy established a template that writers and filmmakers continue to follow. The idea of the pirate as gentleman of fortune rather than mindless criminal owes much to the historical reality of John Rackham's career. Even his failures contributed to his legend. The fact that he was ultimately captured and executed only reinforced the tragic, romantic appeal of his story, providing the kind of dramatic conclusion that pure success could never have achieved. He became a cautionary tale and an inspiration simultaneously, depending on the moral perspective of his audience. Modern archaeological efforts to locate and excavate pirate sites in the Caribbean have added new dimensions to Rackham's story, though physical evidence of his activities remains frustratingly scarce. Unlike Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge, which has yielded substantial artifacts and scientific data, the Revenge and her contents remain lost to history. existing only in documentary records and popular imagination. This absence of physical evidence has, paradoxically, enhanced rather than diminished Rackham's legendary status. Without artifacts to anchor him in prosaic reality, he remains free to inhabit the realm of pure legend. A figure whose historical existence is certain, but whose specific details remain tantalizingly elusive. The mystery surrounding Anne Bonny's ultimate fate has added another layer of intrigue to the Calico Jack legend. The woman who shared his bed and his dangers simply vanished from history after their capture, leaving behind only questions and speculation. Did she escape? Was she pardoned? Did she return to a conventional life under an assumed identity? Each possibility has generated its own body of literature and legend. Modern feminist scholarship has found in Anne and Mary examples of women who successfully challenged gender conventions centuries before such challenges became socially acceptable. Their ability to function effectively in the aggressively masculine world of Caribbean piracy has made them icons for those seeking historical precedents for female empowerment and independence. But perhaps the most enduring aspect of Calico Jack's legacy is what his story reveals about the relationship between style and substance, image and reality. He understood intuitively that in a world of limited opportunities and rigid social hierarchies, the right combination of competence and theatrical flair could create possibilities that pure merit or pure rebellion could never achieve alone. His approach to piracy was fundamentally different from that of contemporaries like Blackbeard or Bartholomew Roberts, less focused on pure intimidation or overwhelming force than on creating a distinctive brand that would be recognized and respected throughout the Caribbean. He was, in many ways, the first modern celebrity criminal, a man who understood that reputation could be more valuable than any treasure. The fact that his actual career lasted barely 2 years, while his legendary status has endured for 3 centuries, speaks to the power of that approach. He achieved in death what he had sought in life, a form of immortality that transcended the ordinary constraints of time and mortality. His story also illuminates the complex moral landscape of the early 18th century Caribbean, where the boundaries between legal and illegal, civilized and savage, acceptable and unacceptable, were constantly shifting and frequently ambiguous. The colonial society that condemned him was itself built upon systems of exploitation and violence that differed from piracy more in their legal status than in their essential nature. Rackham's gentleman pirate persona can be seen as a sophisticated commentary on these moral ambiguities, a way of highlighting the hypocrisy inherent in a system that condemned individual theft while sanctioning institutional exploitation. His elegant manners and civilized treatment of prisoners served as implicit criticism of the brutal realities that characterized legitimate colonial commerce. Yet there was also something genuinely attractive about the alternative social order that he and his crew created aboard the Revenge. Their articles of agreement, their democratic decision-making processes, their relatively egalitarian distribution of spoils all represented improvements over the harsh hierarchies and arbitrary punishments that characterized both military and merchant vessels of the era. The fact that this alternative society ultimately failed does not diminish its historical significance or its continuing appeal to those who dream of more just and equitable forms of social organization. Rackham's crew demonstrated that different arrangements were possible, even if they were not sustainable under the political and economic conditions of their time. In the end, perhaps that is Calico Jack's most important legacy. The demonstration that even in the most constrained circumstances, individuals can choose to live according to their own values rather than accepting the limitations that society attempts to impose upon them. His story remains compelling, not because we approve of piracy, but because we admire the courage required to chart one's own course through life. The silk scarves that fluttered from his coat may have been stilled by the hangman's rope, but the principles they represented, the belief in individual freedom, the rejection of arbitrary authority, the commitment to living life on one's own terms, continue to inspire those who refuse to accept that the world must always be exactly as they found it. 3 centuries after his death, Calico Jack Rackham remains what he always was, a reminder that style and courage, properly combined, can create legends that outlast empires and influence that transcends the ordinary boundaries of time and space. But let us delve deeper into the man behind the legend, for there are layers to Calico Jack's story that have been obscured by centuries of romanticization and myth-making. The historical record, fragmentary though it is, reveals nuances and complexities that make him an even more fascinating figure than the simplified version that popular culture has embraced. Consider, for instance, the remarkable sophistication of his operational methods. While other pirate captains relied primarily on surprise and overwhelming force, Rackham developed what can only be described as an early form of psychological warfare. His intelligence network throughout the Caribbean was more extensive than that of many legitimate governments, fed by tavern keepers, dock workers, disgruntled sailors, and even respectable merchants, who found it profitable to maintain cordial relations with the pirates who might otherwise target their vessels. This network provided him with detailed information about shipping schedules, cargo manifests, defensive preparations, and the personal habits of potential targets. He knew which merchant captains were likely to fight and which would surrender at the first sign of resistance. He understood the political relationships between different colonial governors and could predict which authorities would pursue him aggressively and which would be content with token efforts that could be reported to London as evidence of their diligence. The intelligence gathering was complemented by what modern analysts would recognize as sophisticated propaganda operations. Rackham understood that reputation was his most valuable asset, more important than any treasure he might accumulate. He carefully cultivated stories about his exploits, ensuring that accounts of his victories emphasized his tactical brilliance and gentlemanly conduct, while his failures were either suppressed entirely or reframed as evidence of his merciful nature. These propaganda efforts extended to his treatment of prisoners, which served multiple strategic purposes beyond mere humanitarian concerns. By treating captives with unusual courtesy and restraint, he encouraged merchant captains to surrender without resistance, reducing the risk to his own crew while preserving valuable cargo that might otherwise be damaged in combat. More importantly, he ensured that survivors would spread favorable accounts of their treatment, making future victims more likely to cooperate. The psychological impact of these tactics cannot be overstated. In an age when most pirates were viewed as barely human monsters who would torture and murder their victims for sport, Rackham presented himself as a rational actor who could be negotiated with and trusted to honor agreements. This reputation made it possible for him to extract information and cooperation from prisoners who would have died before revealing anything to a conventional pirate captain. His understanding of economics was equally sophisticated. While many pirates focused on immediate gratification, seizing whatever cargo seemed most valuable and spending their shares as quickly as possible, Rackham took a longer view of wealth accumulation. He understood that the true value of many cargoes lay not in their immediate sale price, but in their strategic importance to colonial trade networks. By selectively targeting vessels carrying critical supplies or key personnel, he could disrupt entire commercial systems while positioning himself to profit from the resulting shortages and dislocations. When he captured a ship loaded with medical supplies, he didn't simply sell them to the highest bidder. He used them as diplomatic tools, offering them to colonial officials in exchange for information, safe passage, or temporary immunity from prosecution. This strategic approach to piracy required a level of planning and foresight that distinguished Rackham from his more impulsive contemporaries. He maintained detailed records of shipping patterns, seasonal variations in cargo types, and the operational capabilities of different colonial naval forces. His cabin aboard the Revenge was reportedly lined with charts and documents that would have been the envy of any legitimate merchant or naval commander. The sophistication of his approach was perhaps most evident in his use of multiple vessels and coordinated operations. While he is most famous for his association with the Revenge, contemporary records suggest that he actually commanded a small fleet of vessels at various times. using them to create complex tactical scenarios that maximized his chances of success while minimizing his risks. These coordinated operations required exceptional leadership skills and organizational abilities. Managing a single pirate crew was challenging enough. Given the independent nature of the men involved and their tendency toward violence and coordinating multiple crews across several vessels required the kind of diplomatic and administrative talents that would have served him well in any legitimate profession. His crew management techniques were particularly innovative, rather than relying on traditional maritime discipline enforced through flogging and other physical punishments. Rackham created a system of incentives and shared governance that encouraged voluntary cooperation while maintaining necessary command authority. His articles of agreement were more sophisticated than most constitutional documents of the era, carefully balancing individual rights with collective responsibilities. Under these articles, crew members had guaranteed rights to their shares of prize money, fair treatment in case of injury or illness, and participation in major tactical and strategic decisions. In return, they agreed to specific standards of conduct aboard ship, including restrictions on gambling, drinking, and personal conflicts that might interfere with operational effectiveness. The democratic elements of Rackham's shipboard governance were remarkable for their time and place. Major decisions were put to votes by the entire crew, with officers serving more as advisors and implementers than as absolute authorities. This system created a sense of shared ownership and responsibility that helped maintain morale during difficult periods and reduced the likelihood of mutiny or desertion. Yet this democratic approach never undermined Rackham's ultimate authority as captain. He understood intuitively that effective leadership required knowing when to consult with subordinates and when to make unilateral decisions. His ability to balance consultation with command, democracy with discipline, was one of the keys to his operational success and crew loyalty. The relationship between Rackham and his crew was further complicated by the presence of Bonny and Mary Read, whose gender created unprecedented challenges for traditional maritime social structures. The integration of women into what had always been an exclusively masculine environment required careful management of personalities, emotions, and established hierarchies. Contemporary accounts suggest that both women earned the respect of their male crewmates through demonstrated competence rather than special treatment. They were expected to perform the same duties, face the same dangers, and abide by the same rules as any other crew member. This egalitarian approach was revolutionary for its time and created a unique social dynamic that distinguished the Revenge from every other vessel in Caribbean waters. The presence of women aboard the Revenge also affected the ship's relationships with other pirate crews and colonial authorities. Some captains refused to associate with Rackham because they viewed his acceptance of female crew members as a violation of maritime tradition. Colonial officials found themselves struggling to develop appropriate legal and social responses to the unprecedented situation of women who had chosen to embrace piracy. But perhaps most significantly, the women's presence forced Rackham to confront questions about gender, power, and social organization that few men of his era ever had to consider. Their success as pirates challenged fundamental assumptions about female capabilities and limitations, while their relationships with male crew members created complex emotional dynamics that required constant, careful management. Bonny's background as the daughter of a wealthy Charleston lawyer added another layer of complexity to her relationship with Rackham and their shared criminal enterprise. Unlike most pirates, who came from impoverished or working-class backgrounds, Anne had deliberately chosen to abandon a life of comfort and respectability for the dangerous freedom of piracy. Her decision was particularly remarkable, given the limited options available to women of her social class in colonial society. Respectable women were expected to marry well, manage households, and bear children, with their identities and legal rights entirely subsumed under those of their fathers and husbands. By choosing piracy, Anne was rejecting not just social conventions, but the entire system of gender relations that defined colonial culture. Mary Read's background was different, but equally unconventional. Born illegitimate in England, she had been raised as a boy to help her mother collect financial support from relatives who believed they were caring for a male heir. This early experience with gender deception had prepared her for a life of challenging social boundaries and conventional expectations. Her service as a soldier in the British Army had given her military training and combat experience that proved invaluable aboard the Revenge. Unlike Anne, who had to learn the skills of piracy from scratch, Mary brought professional military expertise that enhanced the crew's overall effectiveness and tactical capabilities. The partnership between Anne and Mary created a unique dynamic aboard the Revenge that contemporary observers found both fascinating and disturbing. To women who had successfully penetrated and thrived in traditionally masculine environments, had found each other and formed an alliance that challenged every assumption about female nature and capabilities. Their relationship with Rackham was equally complex and unprecedented. Contemporary accounts suggest that both women served as his confidants and advisors, providing perspectives and insights that his male officers could not offer. Their intimate knowledge of his plans and operations made them invaluable members of his inner circle, while their combat skills and leadership abilities made them respected figures throughout the crew. But the emotional complications of these relationships also created vulnerabilities that Rackham's enemies could potentially exploit. The intensity of the personal bonds between the three principals created jealousies and tensions that sometimes interfered with operational decision-making. Their commitment to protecting each other could override strategic considerations, leading to tactical mistakes that a more emotionally detached commander might have avoided. The trial that followed their capture revealed the full extent of these emotional complications. Contemporary accounts describe Rackham's visible distress at seeing Anne and Mary in custody, his desperate attempts to arrange for their escape or pardon, and his ultimate acceptance that their fates were beyond his control. The man who had built his reputation on cool calculation and strategic thinking found himself overwhelmed by emotions that he had never expected to experience. Anne's famous final words to Rackham reportedly telling him that if he had fought like a man, he would not have died like a dog, revealed the depth of her disappointment and anger at his failure to live up to the heroic standards that their relationship had established. The woman who had abandoned respectability for love found herself confronting the reality that even her chosen partner could fail to meet the demands that their extraordinary circumstances required. The trial itself became a sensation that reverberated far beyond the Caribbean, as newspapers throughout the Atlantic world struggled to make sense of the unprecedented spectacle of women pirates. The legal system found itself confronting questions for which centuries of jurisprudence had provided no clear answers. Could women be held to the same standards of criminal responsibility as men? Did their gender provide any mitigation for their crimes? How should society respond to females who had so completely violated every assumption about proper feminine behavior? The judges who presided over the trial were clearly uncomfortable with the situation they faced. Traditional legal precedents assumed that women who committed crimes were either acting under male coercion or were suffering from mental defects that impaired their judgment. But Anne and Mary had clearly chosen their criminal careers voluntarily and demonstrated tactical and leadership abilities that contradicted any assumption of diminished capacity. The prosecution struggled to present their case in terms that made sense within existing legal frameworks, while the defense found itself arguing for mercy based on gender stereotypes that their clients had spent years violating through their actions. The result was a legal proceeding that satisfied no one and resolved none of the fundamental questions that the case had raised about gender, crime, and social responsibility. The sentences that were ultimately imposed reflected this confusion and uncertainty. Rackham and his male crew members received the standard punishment for piracy, death by hanging, while Anne and Mary were granted stays of execution based on their pregnancies. The different treatment accorded to male and female defendants highlighted the legal system as inability to develop coherent responses to unprecedented situations. Rackham's execution was conducted with the same theatrical flair that had characterized his entire career. Contemporary accounts describe him maintaining his composure and dignity throughout the proceedings, delivering a final speech that acknowledged his crimes while defending his choices and expressing no regret for the path he had chosen. His final words, whatever their exact content, established a template for every romantic pirate death scene that would follow in literature and popular culture. Here was a man who faced death with the same style and courage that had made him famous in life, refusing to compromise his principles or beg for mercy even when confronted with the ultimate penalty. The location chosen for his execution gallows point in Port Royal was itself laden with symbolic significance. Port Royal had once been the unofficial capital of Caribbean piracy, a place where freebooters and privateers had openly celebrated their victories and planned their expeditions. By the time of Rackham's death, the city had been transformed into a respectable commercial center, and his execution served as a public demonstration that the age of piracy was definitively over. The crowd that gathered to witness his death represented a cross-section of Caribbean colonial society, from wealthy merchants and government officials to sailors, dockworkers, and former pirates, who had accepted royal pardons and attempted to return to legitimate occupations. For many observers, Rackham's execution marked the end of an era and the final victory of law and order over chaos and individual freedom. But even in death, Rackham managed to maintain the mystique that had made him legendary. His body was hanged in chains at Rackham's Cay as a warning to potential followers. But the location quickly became a pilgrimage site for those who admired what he had represented. Sailors passing the quay would remove their hats out of respect, while local inhabitants developed elaborate folklore about supernatural visitations and mysterious lights. The transformation of his death site into a place of unofficial remembrance demonstrated the complex relationship between official authority and popular sentiment in colonial Caribbean society. While the government intended his displayed corpse to serve as a deterrent, many observers interpreted it as a martyrdom that validated rather than condemned his choices. Within months of his execution, ballads and stories about Calico Jack were circulating throughout the Atlantic world, each version adding new details and embellishments to an already extraordinary narrative. The man who had understood the importance of reputation management in life found that death had freed his story from the constraints of factual accuracy, allowing it to grow and evolve according to the needs and desires of successive generations. The mythologizing process was accelerated by the mysterious fate of Bonny, whose disappearance from the historical record after her trial created a void that imagination rushed to fill. Without definitive knowledge of what happened to her, storytellers were free to create endings that satisfied their artistic and emotional needs, rather than historical accuracy. Some versions of the story had an escaping from prison and returning to piracy under an assumed identity. Others described her being pardoned through her father's influence and returning to respectable society as a cautionary example of reformed criminality. Still others portrayed her dying in prison of a broken heart, unable to survive the loss of her beloved captain and the life of freedom they had shared. Each version of Anne's story reflected different attitudes toward women, crime, and social redemption, but all of them served to enhance rather than diminish Calico Jack's legendary status. As the woman who had loved him enough to abandon everything for his sake, she became an integral part of his mythology, proof that his charismatic appeal extended beyond mere criminal associates to encompass the deepest human emotions. Mary Read's death in prison before her trial could be completed added another layer of tragedy to the story, reinforcing themes of waste and lost potential that resonated with audiences who viewed piracy as a romantic but ultimately doomed form of rebellion against social constraints. Her military background and demonstrated courage made her a particularly sympathetic figure, a woman who had successfully challenged gender conventions only to die in captivity. Before she could enjoy the fruits of her success, the speed with which the Calico Jack legend spread and evolved demonstrated the hunger for stories that challenged conventional moral and social categories. In an age of increasing regulation and social control, audiences craved narratives about individuals who had successfully defied authority and lived according to their own rules. even if such defiance ultimately led to destruction. The legend also served important psychological functions for colonial societies that were themselves built upon various forms of exploitation and violence. By focusing on the romantic aspects of piracy while condemning its criminal elements, audiences could enjoy vicarious participation in rebellion while maintaining their commitment to law and order. Rackham's story was particularly well-suited to this kind of moral complexity because his gentlemanly approach to piracy made him easier to admire than more brutal contemporaries. His courtesy to prisoners, his democratic leadership style, and his romantic relationships created a version of piracy that seemed almost civilized, allowing audiences to celebrate his freedom without fully confronting the violence and theft that made such freedom possible. The enduring appeal of the Calico Jack legend also reflects deeper human concerns about the relationship between individual desire and social responsibility. His story poses questions that remain relevant centuries after his death. To what extent should individuals be free to pursue their own happiness regardless of social consequences? What obligations do we owe to the communities and institutions that shape our lives? When does the pursuit of personal freedom become mere selfishness? These questions have no easy answers, which helps explain why Rackham's story continues to fascinate new generations of readers and viewers. Each era finds in his tale reflections of their own struggles with authority, conformity, and the tension between individual ambition and collective welfare. The gentleman of fortune sails on, his flag still flying in the realm of human imagination, where all the great adventures begin and end, an eternal reminder that some dreams are too powerful to be contained by the ordinary boundaries of life and death.